Welcome to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution of the United States. Now, here's your host, the director of the Virtual Center, Dr. Bill O'Brien.
Good afternoon, and welcome to another week with the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution. I am Bill O'Brien, and it is a pleasure to be with you this week. I spent quite a bit of time today trying to recall where we left off when we stopped our programming last Wednesday, but I think I remember. Let me begin first of all by thanking you for joining us today, and if you will be joining us later on a archived recording of this program on your iPod or whatever, then let me welcome you as well. Although it'll be a while before you get that welcome if you're not listening live, and I know a lot of people aren't. I got a wonderful email last week from Taiwan, and it, of course, reminded me that when we're on live, it's 4 o'clock in the morning there, so chances are that I wouldn't be getting a call in from Taiwan anytime soon. Possible, but not likely was the spin on that. But I appreciated the email so much, and I appreciate all of you who are listening and all of you who will continue to listen to today's program. Let me encourage you, for those who are indeed listening live, let me encourage you to share your ideas and your thoughts and concerns or contributions if that's the direction of your thinking with our listeners, because first of all, I know that they would love to hear a voice other than mine for a change, and so would I. And with that in mind, what I want to emphasize is that you will be welcome. If you are a listener of the Head On Radio Network, if you are a regular listener of the Horn, but even if you are a casual listener, if you have already, in the short time that we've been on with this program, if you've become a fan of this program and kind of tune in to see what the topic is each day, we welcome you. The point that I would like to make is if you do indeed give us a call, you will be welcome. I will welcome you. Our listeners will welcome you. And don't hesitate for 1 second by being concerned that your ideas may not be worth putting on the air. Let me tell you that if you're listening to this program, then that says an awful lot about you. And that means that your ideas and your thinking and your contributions are indeed welcome and will enlighten all of us, I'm sure. And you will be welcome that way. The number, if you are inclined to call us, and we do invite you to do so, is area code 304-658-3333. That's area code 304-658-3333. And if you would like to drop me an email about the program itself, you'd like to contact me directly, I promise that I will get back to you ASAP. It obviously won't be while I'm on the air, but it'll probably be this evening or in the morning for sure. I'm getting a lot of emails right now because I have final exams coming in as attachments to emails, and the class that is submitting their final exams to me today numbers 33 students. So I'm anticipating that between now and midnight Eastern Standard Time today, I'm going to get a number of emails. But I want to assure you that if yours is among them, I will make it a point to respond as soon as I can, because I think the fact that you took the time to write an email gives you the right to expect at least that. And so I want to encourage you to do that if you are inclined. My email address, waobrien906@gmail.com. That's W-A-O'Brien, all one word, O-B-R-I-E-N, 906 at gmail.com. And again, the phone number, 304-658-3333. Before we get into a program today, and I want to begin by perhaps going back and touching a few bases that we that we left last Wednesday, I want to encourage you, if you've got some time, today, tomorrow, this evening, whenever, to go on the Prism WV website. That's Prism, Prism, M as in many. I want people to know it's not prison, it's Prism, WV.org. That's the grant that we have. We've been doing a number of chats on weekends, as many of you know. I know a number of you, regular listeners and participants in the Horn, are tuning into these chats. On Saturday, we were privileged, and I say that very advisedly because it was definitely our advantage. If we were conducting a tennis match, we would have to say that advantage audience on Saturday. We were privileged to have the better part, almost all of the 2 hours, filled by Jeremy Surrey, who is an American foreign policy historian at the University of Texas in Austin. And he was kind enough to give up 2 hours of his Saturday afternoon to be with us, talk about his book, and I'll get into, mention his book in a moment, and then basically elaborate on it to the point that it was absolutely an incredibly enlightening 2 hours. Jeremy Surrey's book is entitled Liberty's Surest Guardians. Liberty's Surest Guardian. Surest, S-U-R-E-S-T. Basically, it is a book about the history of American foreign policy around the concept, the idea of nation building. That is the theme of Surrey's book, and that is the theme of its thesis. That he makes the point in his preface that nation building is, or seems to be, in America's DNA, so to speak. In other words, it is such an inherent part of American history as the nation evolved over the years and over the decades, that you could say that it seems to be an inherent, it's as he says, nation building is built into America's DNA. And the title of the book, Liberty's Surest Guardian, is based on the idea that nation building stands as America's principal foreign policy strategy. Our security in the world, Surrey argues, is based on our ability to clone ourselves in the world around us. In other words, to find ways to nation build, to subsidize and support and provide the expertise to build as many societies built upon the ingredients or the foundations upon which ours is built. The idea being that the more there are of us out there, the more secure we are in terms of our economy, in terms of our culture, in terms of jobs, and all the rest of it. It is pretty much based on the idea that America's economy, America's economic development, as well as its social development, and all related to these things, is tied up with the concept of nation building. And Surrey is the first to admit that American foreign policy has not always been successful. He points out that in our history we have had successful nation building, and the example, the best example that he gives, he mentioned this more than once during our chat on Saturday, is Japan. Germany after World War II, the rebuilding of Germany under the Marshall Plan after World War II. So he points out that our successes are there, that there are clear successes to America's nation-building ventures, but there are failures as well. And the one, of course, that he gives most attention to is Vietnam. He sees Vietnam as being a classic example of failure in America's in achieving America's foreign policy priorities. And he points out that many of our behavior, many of our activities in Latin America over the years have been less than howling successes as well. We found ourselves in positions more than once of supporting governments that were not supported by their own people. We found ourselves supporting governments that were facing revolutions by their own people. We found ourselves at odds by supporting the government while the people of that particular society were not supporters of the government. And we found ourselves in a number of binds, a number of foreign policy situations, if that's a proper word, as a result of that. But that does not deny the thesis that in a sense, successful or unsuccessful, nation building, to Jeremy Surrey, seems to be the best way to understand America's foreign policy priorities through the years. I asked him, and in fact I told him in an email prior to the program, because he wanted some idea as to where we were. Let me explain that this 2-hour chat with Jeremy Surrey was the 7th 2-hour chat that we have had this semester in a course on American foreign policy. And of course, advisedly, we kept him for the concluding chat, for the final session. And so he wanted to know basically where we were and what we had, what we had covered and what exactly we wanted him to do. So I sent him an email last week and told him pretty much where we were, and that my goal had been to kind of lay the groundwork for his presentation on nation building. And the one thing that I did alert him to is that I told him that I thought it would come up. If nobody else raised it, I would. And that would be to contrast his approach to nation building with the more negative approach to American expansion over the years, penned by the very famous Wisconsin historian William Appleman Williams, most noted for his very famous book, The Tragedy of American Diplomacy. And so I kind of alerted Professor Surrey to the reality that he would be asked a question which asked him to compare and contrast and work out the differences between his approach to American foreign policy and that written so successfully about by William Appleman Williams in the 60s and 70s. William Appleman Williams passed away in the mid-90s, I believe 1995 to be exact, 20 years ago now. But I think his approach to American foreign policy is still very, very widely discussed and understood. This didn't come up during the discussion with Professor Surrey. I meant to raise it and I didn't, but I'll throw it out here for what it's worth. One of the things that I have noticed as someone who has spent his life in higher education, one of the things I've noticed is that with the demise, of William Appleman Williams and those critics of American foreign policy associated with William Appleman Williams in the so-called Wisconsin School of History that he gave his name to. And I can think of a number of other historians, foreign policy historians that fall in that ilk. Some of them were students of William Appleman Williams. I'm thinking of Thomas McCormick and a number of others who are very, very prominent foreign policy diplomats and scholars in the history of American foreign policy. One of the things that I noted after the 60s and 70s is that as many of these folks passed away or retired, many of these foreign policy positions in prominent history departments throughout the United States, in many cases, these positions were not filled. If they were filled by somebody other than a foreign policy historian. What I mean is that over the last 25 to 30 years, the study of American foreign policy as a particular focus within history departments in major colleges and universities in America has been on the decline. To be very honest with you, Jeremy Surrey's position at the University of Texas, while at one point this position was was the Texas version of positions in a number of other history departments throughout the country, that's not necessarily true anymore. Surrey is, it seemed to me, his program, his presence in the faculty at the University of Texas is, at least from my perspective, and this is not research that I did, it's just an observation, kind of a declining phenomenon. History departments have not been as ready to replace foreign policy historians with other foreign policy historians. And the result has been that particular concentration within graduate programs has become less and less popular as the years have gone on. What we see is that fewer and fewer foreign policy PhDs are coming are coming into focus, are coming on the market, as it were, in the last 25 to 30 years. Now, the question is that just a happenstance? Is that just a coincidence? Is it a logical response that university history departments have made to a declining interest and market in graduate students who are seeking admission into graduate programs in American foreign policy? I don't think so. On the contrary, I think that William Appleman Williams, Thomas McCormick, and some of the other more noted foreign policy historians over the years have given the study of American foreign policy a focus and an emphasis which made it extremely attractive to up-and-coming graduate students. Consequently, I'm kind of struck by the fact that while the interest was there, the product was on the decline. And I've wondered why. It is my feeling, this is just a feeling, it's just an observation, I have not done any research to support this, that some of this decline might be in response to the popularity of William Appleman Williams and to the extent to which extremely competent, qualified graduate students were going into this field. To be very honest with you, what happened in America in the 1960s and 70s and 80s, especially revolving around Vietnam, was one of the more traumatic periods in American history. And a lot of it was driven by people that were generating the kind of research and the kind of interpretations of American foreign policy priorities that Williams and others were putting out there. To be very honest with you, this was stuff that made a lot of people, a lot of prominent people, extremely uncomfortable. And I'm wondering whether the decline in the numbers of institutions that have retained a foreign policy focus within their history graduate programs can be explained in part, at least, by an effort to try to downgrade the emphasis and channel some of this research and graduate talent in alternative directions. The one thing that we see if we study American history generally is that foreign policy has always been, in the minds of those who make it, kind of a closed shop. While we have a Republican form of government and while we encourage participation of the citizenry, free discussion of issues, debates, mass participation in our electoral process. In other words, the strength of our Republican form of government is based on the participation of its citizens. But those who are most directly involved in foreign policy have always believed that foreign policy ought not to be included in that openness. that from the very beginning there's been something a little bit private, a little bit sacred, a little bit close to the vest, as it were, in foreign policy. And you can see this in that administrations over the years tended to appoint people as ambassadors who were trustworthy. It seemed to me that the people that we were putting in foreign capitals around the world to represent the United States, with obvious exceptions. One of the exceptions is William Howard Taft, for example, who served as American ambassador in the Philippines during the Spanish-American War in the late 19th century, and accomplished incredible things in the Philippines as governor of an independent Philippines. After the war was over and after the struggles over the Philippines with Aguinaldo and the rebellion there were put down. Taft was a governor and did from all everything we can find out, did a stellar job out there. So I'm not saying that they were not. John Hayes, Secretary of State, there were superbly competent, qualified people making American foreign policy. Please don't get me wrong. But the reality is that many administrations began to reward friends and those who gave the largest political contributions were oftentimes rewarded with ambassadorships. And so competence didn't seem to be a priority on one's resume in order to secure an ambassadorial position or a key position in American foreign policy. The most important thing seemed to be loyalty to the administration and a willingness to support the particular positions that the administration in power at the time was espousing. So my point is that, I've always had the feeling that those who are most involved in foreign policy have never really felt comfortable opening up foreign policy decision-making to the electorate at large, to the citizenry at large. I think you can see this even played out today in recent times. Most of the time, some of the most embarrassing situations that administrations find themselves in are foreign policy situations, are situations related to our foreign policy. I'm thinking right now of the Benghazi situation and the assassination some months ago of Christopher Stevens, the very popular ambassador in Libya, and the troubles that has created for the Obama administration, because our ambassador at the time to the UN, Susan Rice, went on television well after the event and basically painted a picture of the fact that the administration believed from the very beginning that the attack on our embassy in Benghazi was a spontaneous act rather than part of an Al Qaeda or a terrorist plot of any sort. And now there's evidence that continues to surface, which suggests that may not be true. The point I'm trying to make is that administrations in the past have found themselves in very difficult political positions related to foreign policy when decision-making becomes public. And so there has been an effort over the years to keep it private. And when you had somebody like William Appleman Williams and those who became so popular that their popularity exceeded the historical profession itself, and they became icons. They became popular for their positions on American foreign policy and what the nation went through during the Vietnam situation and the release of the Pentagon Papers, which followed that. You can kind of begin to understand that some of this seems to have a little bit of credibility. And I'm wondering whether all of this has played itself out in the reluctance of some history departments to fill these particular research positions. Just a thought. The fact of the matter is Jeremy Surrey, if that's true, is an exception. Jeremy Surrey is one of, and I think those who were privy to be with us on Saturday will attest to this, that Jeremy Surrey clearly is one of the leading lights in the study in the research associated with American foreign policy in America today. We were very, very honored to have him. The 2 hours was absolutely rich in information and in insight. We had a number of emails from our enrolled teachers in our PRISM program who confirmed the fact that Surrey's presentation was one of our best. It was well worth waiting for. It was very, very informative, and he gave our teachers so much that they can use that they wouldn't have had in any other way. And so the interaction between Surrey's approach to foreign policy, which is nation building, and William Appleman Williams' association with it, that our expansion and our nation building was in effect empire building, which is much more negative than is Surrey's approach toward nation building. I think you begin to get the idea. They are not at odds by any stretch, because Surrey is as willing as anybody to acknowledge that American nation building has been fraught with mistakes, with errors, and with unsuccessful efforts. He does point out, however, that when you look at Japan and you look at post-war Germany and some of our other efforts, we have been successful as well. The other thing to keep in mind is that the model of nation building that Surrey is talking about is very, very close. It's quite symmetrical to the open door concept that William Appleman Williams focuses so much about. The idea of free trade, the idea of opportunities for investment and increased open trade, and all the rest of it. In other words, Surrey's position is that successful nation building for the United States results in free market, open trading with partners, which becomes a win-win for both sides. That's ultimately what any nation's foreign policy is about, is to basically engage in activities which produce a win-win for all those people involved. And Surrey made the point in response to my question that the nation building that he's talking about does not result in the colonial economy from the perspective of the developing nation. It is not involved in a permanent colonial economy based on extraction of its resources. Of course, that's pretty much Williams's position, that our foreign policy has never been intended to be a win-win situation, rather has always been intended to be a win situation for us, and however much it can be a win situation for those on the other end, given that its economy will remain colonial, because our number one priority has been to exploit resources of those underdeveloped or third world nations that we have had relationships with. It's a very, very complex issue. It's a very, very important issue. We got into Iraq. We got into Afghanistan. We talked a little bit about the current situation that's going on in Syria. For those of you who are really interested in what's going on in the world and what has gone on in the past, I don't think you could spend a more profitable 2 hours than going on prismwv.org website, Prism West Virginia website, or on the Horn, and access the archived presentation of last Saturday's chat with Jeremy Surrey. I think you'll find it a valuable investment of your valuable time. Well, I mentioned I thought that I would make mention of the Saturday chat, and I did, for a full half hour. So here we are at the bottom of our first hour, and we're about to crank up. We're about to get started. So again, let me take this opportunity to reiterate the phone number, as well as my email address. If you would like to reach us by phone and come on the air and talk about some of these issues, we'd love to hear from you. The number is area code 304-658-3333. 304-658-3333. My email address, if you'd like to contact me directly, W-A-O'Brien, I-E-N, 906, all one word, at gmail.com. Did receive an email over the weekend by one of our regular listeners, one of the regular Horn listeners, Betsy. And Betsy made me aware, gave me a link to the to a new website for teachers, which is called the Educator's Room. And the premise, the introduction, the narrative that associated with the website makes the very, very telling point that in our society today, with its emphasis on budgets and its emphasis on attracting federal funds and its emphasis on standardized tests, we have reached a point where teachers are among the elements or constituencies within our population that currently enjoys less First Amendment freedoms of speech, assembly, press, and the rest of it than any other constituency. Basically, what the website indicated, and I think the fact that she gave me the link to it indicated that she presumed, and rightly so, that I would be very, very interested in this. It's called the Educator's Room, and it's a chat opportunity where teachers can exchange ideas and exchange points of view and perceptions on what's happening in the world of education, in the world of the classroom, in which they are the professionals. Yet, call them professionals, call them what you will. The fact of the matter is, many of them are in such vulnerable positions that they are reluctant to express their opinion on prominent issues. And I think that's one of the issues that's raised. So I thank Betsy for that email. And I encourage all of you to look on that website, look up, just Google the Educator's Room, and I think you'll gain access to that same website. I think it's extremely informative. I think it's extremely troubling that teachers believe that a website like that is necessary. I have no doubt that they are correct. You know, as you know, much of our educational reform in today's world tends to blame our failures on the teacher. The teachers increasingly have become scapegoats for much of the failures of our education system in a lot of different ways. And I think over the, you know, in previous programs, and we'll continue to do this, it's clear to me that if there is failure in our education system, it does not necessarily rest with teachers. That there's enough blame to go around is basically what I would say. Let's stop for a moment and try to recreate where we were last Wednesday when we suspended last week's programming here on the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution. If you remember, we had gone back to 1776 and we were looking at the circumstances which produced independence in the first place. And one of the issues that I had tried to raise, which I think is very significant, is that most of us have been steeped in, have experienced what education we have in the origins of the American independence movement, the origins of the American Revolution, in an approach to the causes of the war for independence, which are based on a particular, I refer to it as the imperialist school of writing. It is based on a particular perspective which is based on the assumption that the problems between Mother Country and her 13 North American colonies in the mid-1770s that leads to the Declaration of Independence, those problems stem from imperial problems in the relationship between Mother Country and her colonies. The operative assumption here is that in order to find the reasons or the causes of American independence, one needs to look at what England did as far as the development of colonial policy during this period, and look at how the colonies responded to those policies, to those activities and actions from the mother country. And of course, most of us know that a lot of this revolves around the idea of taxation without representation and the fact that the colonies were not represented in Parliament, yet they were being taxed to help pay for the French and Indian War and to relieve the debt burden that England found itself in 1763, even though it emerged victorious in the war over France and was literally dominant in the world. It was facing an incredibly high debt. And British policymakers felt that it was only fair that the American colonists participate in helping the mother country pay off this debt, especially since the last war against France, the French and Indian War, or the 7 Years' War, was fought in North America for control of North America. In other words, England had fought this war and expended its treasure to defend the colonists from the French and from their Indian allies. The least the colonies could do was help the mother country pay for it. A little sip of water break there. And so what I have been trying to point out is that while this is the story that all of us grew up with, this is the story that all of us studied in school, the fact of the matter is it's only one story. It is based on a set of assumptions. And one of the assumptions that it's based upon is that the colonies were all the same. What I mean is that the only way to look at the American colonies was to look at them from the mother country's perspective. If you look at the colonies from the mother country's perspective, then all the colonies comprise what the mother country considered to be a portion of its empire whose reason for being was to serve the best interests of the mother country and thereby to adhere to policies and procedures enacted in the mother country for the benefit of the mother country. I mean, if you look at the colonies that way, they're all the same. And that's the way you have to look at it if you assume that the story of independence is the story of the actions and interactions, the reciprocal interaction between mother country and her colonies. On Wednesday last, one of the issues that we confronted is the idea of an alternative thesis to the imperial school approach, which, for lack of a better term, is usually referred to as the internal revolution thesis. It's associated primarily with Merrill Jensen, historian, University of Wisconsin, who's probably most famous for the book he published in the late 1940s, called The Articles of Confederation. And in that book, Jensen initiated a full-scale assault on the imperialist school of interpretation of the origins of the American Revolution. And Jensen put forth the argument that each colony had its own independent story, and that if you look within each colony, you begin to see that there's a whole independent story happening within the colonies themselves. A struggle for power, if you will, between prominent elites for power. As long as the colonies were colonies of the mother country, then the upper echelons of the power structure, the colonial administrations of all the colonies, was directly connected to the mother country. most of the prominent political positions of power in the colonies were placemen of Parliament or members of Parliament, family members, cousins, people that members of Parliament owed debt to of some kind. Kind of like, I mean, not to make the example is not perfect, but kind of like the way that American administrations over the years have appointed ambassadors. The most important thing was not the competence of the person being appointed, rather it was the loyalty and the dependability involved in this particular appointment. Administrations knew that they could rely on 100% cooperation and loyalty from the people that they were putting in foreign capitals around the world as ambassadors of the United States of America. And so the key ingredient of their appointment was not necessarily ability and talent so much as it was loyalty. And to be very honest with you, that's the way that England staffed its colonial administrations to a large degree. Friends of the king or friends of prominent members of Parliament ended up to be royal governors. And these royal governors, in turn, within each colony, appointed their friends to positions of influence. They were the sheriffs, they were the county officials, they were the tax collectors, they were the judges, they were the court administrators, they were the people who made the day-to-day administration of government within each colony function. And their loyalty was to the mother country, not to the colony within which they were connected. Their livelihood was directly dependent on their appointment as a British office holder within the colonies. Therefore, England could depend on them for their loyalty. And certain of England's royal governors have received a lot of attention and a lot of study over the years. One of the most famous royal governors is the royal governor of Massachusetts, not the royal governor, the lieutenant governor of Massachusetts, Thomas Hutchinson. Thomas Hutchinson was the grandson, the very famous grandson of Anne Hutchinson. And you remember the witch trials in the late 1692 in Massachusetts, in Salem, and the decision to expel Anne Hutchinson from Massachusetts. And many of you know that she went to Rhode Island and was later on killed by Indians in Rhode Island. Well, her grandson, Thomas Hutchinson, became lieutenant governor of Massachusetts. He was a resident of Massachusetts, a longtime resident. He was a prominent political leader, a prominent businessman and merchant. And over the years, he developed a following within the colony of Massachusetts that was incredible. It kind of smacked a little bit of what we think of today when we think of the turn of the century, 19th, 20th century, idea of urban political machines, the Daily machine, for example, in Chicago, or the Tammany Hall machine in New York City, if you remember hearing about them, or the Curley machine, James Michael Curley, who was mayor of Boston, and the political machine that he was able to create within the wards or in and around the city of Boston, where James Michael Curley could literally get out the vote almost at the drop of a hat, at a moment's notice. If he needed something, if his supporters needed something, they could depend on placement, on people who were loyal to them to come out and do their thing in support of the machine. That's the kind of machine that Hutchinson had in Massachusetts politics. What that meant was that no matter who you were within Massachusetts, your opportunities for moving up the ladder in terms of position and power and influence, your opportunities were limited unless you found a way to ingratiate yourself with the Hutchinson machine. If you became a friend of the Hutchinson machine, then your potential for political promotion and influence was wide open. But if you found yourself at odds with the machine, at odds with the lieutenant governor, then you can only go so far and no further. And what we see in the 60s and 70s are prominent people, most of them who emerge in the lower house of the legislature within the colony, who become opponents of the Hutchinson machine. They're trying to basically build their careers around opposition to the machine rather than becoming a participant in it. I'm taking a moment because I want to share with you a paragraph from a book on this period by Gordon Wood called The Radicalism of the American Revolution. If any of you are really interested in this, I would suggest that for example, you can get on Kindle, you can get a copy of Radicalism of the American Revolution at a very modest price. It won the Pulitzer Prize when it was written in the early 1990s. In the course of his study, Gordon Wood includes a paragraph about John Hancock and the position and the influence that Hancock had within Massachusetts during the pre-revolutionary period. Let me share, if I can, this paragraph because I think you get an idea of what I mean by political machines during the 18th century. And this is this is from page 88 of Gordon Wood's Radicalism of the American Revolution. Probably no one in late 18th century America used his property and patronage to create political dependencies more shamelessly than John Hancock. Hancock patronized everyone. He made work for people. He erected homes that he did not need. He built ships that he sold at a loss. He sponsored any and every young man who importuned him. Anybody who asked him for help, he was always there with some help. He opened trade shops and staffed them. He purchased a concert hall for public use. He entertained lavishly and habitually treated the Boston populace to wine. John Adams recalled, this is a quote, John Adams recalled that not less than 1,000 families were every day in the year dependent on Mr. Hancock for their daily bread, unquote. He went through the mercantile fortune he had inherited from his uncle, but he formed one of the most elaborate networks of political dependency in 18th century America and became the single most popular and powerful figure in Massachusetts politics during the last quarter of the century. What Gordon Wood has done is lay out in the person of John Hancock how you build a system, a political constituency within colonial politics in America. Hancock did that in Massachusetts. It was obviously not linked to the machine built by Thomas Hutchinson. It was a machine that took root in opposition to Hutchinson. And that's the internal revolution. That's the story that Jensen is telling us, that in every single colony, what you find is there's a really vibrant political struggle going on between the ins and the outs, between the people connected to the British power structure and those people who are not. And it becomes very clear to the leaders of these challenging groups that their political future lies in terminating the British power structure in America, i.e., independence. For many of these people, the only way that you could open up power and position and advantage in colonial America was to break the power of these local political machines. And the only way you could do that is to move the colonies to a decision to be independent. And as I quoted, and this is a quote from a very prominent historian at the turn of the century, one of the people that's referred to as a member of the progressive school of American history around the turn of the century, Carl Becker, who wrote a very famous study of the Declaration of Independence. Becker's research and dissertation took place in New York. In other words, he was studying in New York politics, the contemporary New York version of the Hancock story or the Hutchinson story in Massachusetts. And Carl Becker made the point in his study of New York that what becomes very clear is that there were two revolutions going on. One for home rule, and the other one to determine who would rule at home. The one for home rule is the struggle between the colonies and the mother country. That's the imperial story. But the struggle within each colony over who would rule at home is the internal story. And Becker's conclusion is, if you have to decide which of those two struggles, those two revolutions, is the most important, he would give his vote to the internal struggle. Because increasingly, the more you study the story within each colony, the more you begin to realize that the internal story is playing itself out against the external story. England is playing into the hands of its enemies within colonies without necessarily being aware of it. This is my own conclusion after all of these years. If I were to assign blame or a reason for the American Revolution, I would say that American independence, more than anything else, is the result of management failures on the part of the mother country. The mother country had distinct advantages over her colonies in 1775, 1776. In terms of influence, in terms of power, in terms of the size of her army, in terms of the size of her neighbor, go on and on. In terms of loyalties that she could expect from other nation states in Europe, because all nation states had a vested interest in not seeing a revolution of colonies for independence be successful. Every nation that had colonies, and of course that's part of what being a nation is establishing colonies or areas where you can find raw materials and build markets for the sale of your manufactured goods. Every major nation had colonies. And that meant that they had a vested interest in making sure that America's colonies were not successful against England. Because what was to prevent their colonists from trying the same thing against them? So England had all of these advantages. But one of the negatives, one of the disadvantages that England seemed to have, call it arrogance, call it a lack of insight, call it what you will, England was not inclined to put stock in the advice and wisdom coming from her colonies. One of the things that I've noticed, and other historians have noticed the same thing, is that many of England's office holders within colonies were communicating back to England and were basically pointing out that there was a revolutionary movement afoot within their colony. and its ultimate aim was probably independence, and that the mother country better get a handle on this and do something about it before the movement got so big that it couldn't be stopped. An example, the royal governor of Massachusetts during this period, Francis Bernard. Hutchinson was his lieutenant governor. It seems to me that actually Hutchinson carried more weight and exuded more power within Massachusetts than did the governor. But be that as it may, Francis Bernard was the royal governor. And during the 70s, Bernard is writing letter after letter back to the mother country, back to Parliament. And he's writing specifically to the Parliament, to the administrations in power. And there are a couple of great letters that he writes to Lord North. And basically his position is, what he's telling him is, there's this movement. He's naming names: Hancock, Sam Adams, John Adams, Governor Warren, James Otis, prominent attorney in Massachusetts, in Boston. He's naming names, and he said these people are meeting secretly. They are forming a cabal. They are gradually building their influence within the legislature. Their goal is ultimate independence. You've got to find a way to root them out. You have a lot of loyalty here. You have a lot of support within Massachusetts, Bernard is saying. But what the mother country is doing is enacting policies like the Stamp Act and the Tea Act and all of these things. What England is doing is playing right into the hands of the radicals, and Francis Bernard is pointing that out. And at one point, Lord North writes back to Bernard and basically says to him, if you can't handle your job there, we'll just have to appoint somebody who can. And that seems to me to be kind of typical of England's unwillingness to listen to the people in the know, the people who were in the field and knew what was going on. So whether it's the Adamses and the Hancocks and the Warrens and that group in Massachusetts, or whether it's Samuel Chase, William Packer, Charles Carroll of Carrollton, and some of the others in Maryland, in around Baltimore, whether it's the Christopher Gadsden in Charleston, South Carolina. The point is, within every colony, there are these radicals. In Virginia, it's Patrick Henry, Richard Henry Lee, among others. And within every colony, there is this movement. There is this internal story going on. And if you study that internal story, you quickly begin to realize that the story of American independence may only secondarily be associated with what England's doing, that the real story is in this internal struggle and how these challengers to the British power structure within America, how the Hancocks and the Adamses and the rest of them respond to and deal with the policies and programs that are coming from Parliament, from London. It seems more often than not that England is playing into the hands of the radicals, and in the process is signing its own death warrant in terms of the viability and continued existence of its North American empire. I would say that if there's a culprit here, it's England's inability to manage her empire and unwillingness to listen to those who are giving her good advice. England blew it. Some of the policies and procedures that she enacts are playing right into the hands of those who have a vested interest in finding ways to twist and massage what's coming from England into something that's horrible. The story, if you read the Boston Gazette, the Boston newspapers, you see these stories planted by Sam Adams and others in the Boston newspapers about these strangers that suddenly have popped up within Boston and within the Boston area. The writer of this story is Sam Adams, but he doesn't use his name, obviously. He uses an alias. He talks about the fact that he regularly travels from Cambridge to Boston across the Charles River every day. And on the ferry, he's seen all these people that he's never seen before, all these new people that are very mysterious. They don't talk to anybody. They stay by themselves. They stay off in cars. They're very mysterious. They're very suspicious. And then basically he promises his readers, I'll keep my ear to the ground. If I find out anything, I'll get back to you. So then in the next week's edition of the paper, there'd be another article, and he'd say, here's an update. I talked to somebody who knows one of these people, and the word around is most of them are Catholics. Now, what would Catholics be doing in Boston? And then the argument is, are they connected to the Catholic power structure in Canada? Is this part of the mother country's effort to impose an alien religious and political system on the colonies, on us? What's happening here? Hang on, and I'll get back to you as if I have more information. And it's this kind of thing, and you can see this. And the stories in the private letters of John Adams and Hancock and Sam Adams about the secret meetings at night where they meet with the editor, the publisher of the Boston Gazette, and they plan the next week's paper and what they're going to put in there, what they're going to plant, what story they're going to plant, how they're going to deal with the Boston Massacre. If you read the accounts in the Massachusetts newspapers about the Boston Massacre, you would swear that the British firing on those innocent civilians in Boston was the beginning of World War III. It looks like the end of the world. It looks like the British Army declared open war on the citizens of Boston, when nothing like that was the case. And, of course, we're familiar with the very, very prominent attorney in Boston, John Adams, who agrees to defend the British troops, Preston and his troops, in the Boston Massacre, and he's able to get most of them off. And he has terrible problems for this. And there's a beautiful exchange between John and his cousin Sam Adams. And Sam approaches John and basically says, why in heaven's name did you agree to do this? And John Adams says, first, I'm an attorney. I have a professional obligation to see that people get a fair trial. And I believe that this was not an innocent group of Boston citizens. This was a mob that provoked these British troops. They were scared. They were frightened. They were young. And they were provoked into opening fire. And I'm just doing my job. And the very famous response by Sam Adams is, yes, John, but you have to do it so well. What a beautiful line. Yes, John, we know you're only doing your job, but you have to do it so well. We're at 5, top of the hour. We've completed our first hour. Let's stop and take a break, and we'll continue this. 3 or 4 minutes, we'll get a chance to stand up and stretch and relax, and then we'll come back and we'll complete our program together. You're listening to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution. I'm Bill O'Brien. We'll be right back. We are back with you. This is Bill O'Brien, and we're back for the second hour in today's visit at the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution. Let me begin by giving you, once again, our phone number, area code 304-658-3333. That's 304-658-3333. And if you'd like to email me directly, it's waobrien906@gmail.com. Before we broke at the top of the hour, we were basically looking at the whole issue of the internal revolution and looking at the nature of political machines and the realities of politics in America. And what we're basically finding here is a reason why some people would want independence that had not nearly as much to do. I'm not saying that these people were totally self-interested, but clearly they were not driven exclusively by principle. The tradition that most of us grew up with is the idea that in mass colonists stood up against the mother country because they would not be taxed without representation. They would not allow the mother country to tax them without having representatives sitting in Parliament. They would not allow the British government to suspend duly elected legislatures or to suspend courts or the legal system, or to do a number of other things that the mother country felt that she had the right to do as mother country. And the point that I made last week, and I want to reiterate it again, is that if you look within the Continental Congress itself, the fact of the matter is Richard Henry Lee made his proposal for independence, which passed on June 7th, 1776. Excuse me, June 7th, 1776. But the Declaration is not until July, the Declaration of Independence. Another month goes by. And the fact of the matter is, by the time the Second Continental Congress convenes in 1775, in May of 1775, the war's been going on. Boston's been evacuated by the British in April. The war's going on, and the first order of business, as I believe mentioned last time, is to appoint a commander-in-chief of the Continental Army, and of course that's George Washington. So here we are in May 1775, engaged in a war with a Continental Army and a general appointed to head them. In May 1775, and yet independence doesn't come until June of 1776, and the Declaration until July of 1776. And so the question is, what's the holdup? What's the fear? Why isn't there a unanimous groundswell of support within Congress and everywhere else for independence? Jefferson is going to lay out his case in the Declaration of Independence, but first the Congress has to make the decision to go for independence, and that's not so easy because naturally you find a lot of very conservative people within each state, within each colony, who are very reluctant to support the idea of independence. They're willing to go the extra mile to find a way to remain within the empire and patch up the differences with the mother country. There used to be an event or an item which I remember when I was in grade school, it was one of the items we used to have to memorize. It was called the Olive Branch Petition. Do you remember that in your earlier studies? And the idea was that it was kind of a last gasp effort of the colonies to avoid independence by making one last attempt to lay down the olive branch, so to speak, and beg the mother country not to force us to do this. And what I'm suggesting is, if you look at those people who had reason to support independence above and beyond principle on the one hand, and then you begin to consider the reasons why some people are so opposed to independence on the other, you begin to get a sense of the terms conservatives and radicals that Jensen defined and that we looked at last week. When we talk about radicals, we are not talking about people who want to overturn the whole nature and structure of society and create a whole new social structure, a whole new kind of society. We are talking to prominent people who have made it to a certain level in society, who see advantages to be gained with independence, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they want revolution. It means that they want independence, because with independence comes opportunity. And by this time, by the time you get to 1775 and 76, most of these people are ideologically committed to the principle of republicanism. They go all the way back. If you look at Jefferson's library and Washington and the rest of them and what they're reading and what they're studying, many of them are privy to copies of Cato's letters by Gordon and Trenchard, which are the major Whig criticisms of British Parliament in the early 18th century that have become so appropriate for what the colonists are doing now. that many colonists dredge arguments and positions from Cato's letters and use them against Parliament in 1775, 1776. But it doesn't mean that they're radicals. They're attorneys, they're ministers, they're merchants, they're businessmen, they're bankers, they're investors. They are people who have traveled widely, who are what we would call today cosmopolitan in their outlook. They're well educated. Many of them are college educated. Jefferson went to William and Mary. Madison went to Princeton. And of course, John Adams, we know, went to Harvard. And these are well educated people. They are well read people. And what they do very advisedly. And by this time, most of them are committed to the idea that what we need to do is create republicanism within the American political structure. That what we need to do is pursue independence. And if we set up the proper kind of government, we're going to be able to contain revolution. We don't necessarily subject ourselves to the end of the world once we declare independence. But the most conservative members of Parliament and many of the most prominent people who write in newspapers who are opposed to independence, they really believe that a declaration of independence is the beginning of the end for the society that they know and love. They believe they see people who are desirous of moving up and assuming positions of power. They see a situation where their possessions, their property, would become vulnerable to the mob, to the masses. They see these groups of unemployed tradesmen in the cities. They see seamen who are on liberty or on leave from ships docked in Boston and New York and Baltimore and Providence and Philadelphia and many of these places. They see the inner cities that many of us see today. And they're scared to death because if you declare independence, there goes law and order. It's the equivalent of suspending all the law and order, putting the police force on permanent leave, as it were. What's to contain? What's to contain order? And again, the so-called radicals are not really radicals. They believe that a well-constructed Republican form of government where you have a solid, positive interaction between elected officials and the people who elect them, you will ever maintain good government. They believe that. So this is the issue. And so, in a sense, how these internal forces respond to what the mother country is doing becomes the critical factor. And so if you go into, and I'd like to do it just briefly because there's one item here that I particularly want to make you aware of. If you go into the Continental Congresses, for example, the First Continental Congress meets in the fall of 1774, September of 1774. And it's dominated by conservatives. But there are a large number of radicals within there as well. And so, they begin to debate strategies. And over again, the conservatives carry the day as they are able to successfully get the majority to support one more petition to the king, one more olive branch, as it were, because they're really worried about independence. Part of the reason they worry about independence is because they see disorder coming with the elimination of the mother country as the overriding system, the overriding power structure in colonial America. And over the last couple of weeks, I've given a couple of examples of statements. Let me share with you just a few quotes or a few positions of prominent people on attitudes, just attitudes towards when you begin to pick up the attitude of prominent people toward the masses, toward the common people, you begin to get a sense of what it is that scares them about independence. Let me just share with you a couple of examples. Here's a Here's an article which is prominently read throughout the colonies in the this is in the 1760s in Massachusetts, and it's a widely read work by an agricultural writer in England named Arthur Young. And he's writing, and basically he says that everyone but an idiot knows that the lower class must be kept poor or they will never be industrious, unquote. Think about that. Everyone but an idiot knows that the lower class must be kept poor or they will never be industrious. The only way that poor people will work is if they have to. If you find a way to eliminate their need to work, they won't. Thomas Munn, he was a famous 17th century a prominent writer in the mother country, makes the statement, I love this statement, if the rich do not spend so lavishly, the poor will die. That what makes economies, what makes society go, is the prominence and the leisure and the spending habits of the wealthy. The poor are totally dependent on them. So again, it kind of plays into the idea we hear by conservative terrestrial radio today about the idea that with tax cuts, that the average people, the common people, shouldn't resent the wealthy buying yachts because they get the jobs sustaining the yachts owned by the wealthy. And the very famous line by one of these talk show hosts that I've heard numerous times: go out and get a job, see how much luck you have finding a job working for a poor person. And so in a sense, we really haven't come so far today. Let me share one other with you. This one I believe I paraphrased before, but let me read the exact quote. This time, 1779 in Boston, James Warren was complaining that in Boston, this is a quote, fellows who would have cleaned my shoes 5 years ago have amassed fortunes and are riding in chariots, unquote. Fellows who would have cleaned my shoes 5 years ago have amassed fortunes and are riding in chariots. This is 1779. Of course, this is 3 years after the Declaration of Independence during the war. And you can pick up the tone in that particular quotation. I'm trying to find another. Let me suggest this one. This one is a little bit later in the United States. This one occurs after the adoption of the Constitution in 1787. And it is written by a gentleman, early 19th century, named Benjamin Latrobe. And what he's talking about is the inclination of former colonies, of states now that we're independent, of states to extend the right to vote to the poor, allowing all white males to vote, whether in fact they're property owners or not. And he's very supportive of this. He says, after the adoption of the federal Constitution, the extension of the right of suffrage in all the states to the majority of all the adult male citizens planted a germ which has gradually evolved and has spread actual and practical democracy and political equality over the whole Union. There's no doubt whatsoever but that this state of things in our country produces the greatest sum of happiness that perhaps any nation ever enjoyed. But then he goes on to say the cost has been high because most men have to work, most men have to labor, and consequently those arts and refinements and elegancies which require riches and leisure to their production are not to be found among the majority of our citizens. In other words, one of the things we've lost by letting the masses vote is we've lost the idea that political decisions are being made by people who have the wealth and the position and the refinement and the culture and the leisure to vote intelligently. We run into trouble when we let people who have to work for a living vote, because they neither have the time nor the inclination nor the education to vote intelligently. If some of this sounds familiar, so be it. But let me continue to read, because this quote by Latrobe is one of the best ones I've found in a long time. And he goes on to say that the riches and leisure are not to be found among the majority of our citizens. And he continues, the want of learning and of science in the majority is one of those things which strikes foreigners who visit us very forcibly. Our representatives to all our legislative bodies, national as well as of the states, are elected by the majority sui similis, that is, unlearned. They're elected by the masses. For instance, from Philadelphia and its environs, we send to Congress not one man of letters. One of them indeed is a lawyer, but of no eminence. Another a good mathematician, but when elected he was a clerk in a bank. The others are plain farmers. From the next county is sent a blacksmith, and from just over the river a butcher. Our state legislature does not contain one individual of superior talents. The fact is that superior talents actually excite distrust, and the experience of the world perhaps does not encourage the people to trust men of genius. This government of what may be called an unlettered majority has put down even that ideal rank which manners had established, excepting in our great cities depending on commerce and crowded with foreigners, where the distinction between what is called the gentleman and others still subsists, and produces circles of association separate from each other. In Philadelphia, even this distinction has almost disappeared. Those who expect it, having early excluded themselves from the present race of well-dressed men and women. Of this state of society, the solid and general advantages are undeniable. But to a cultivated mind, to a man of letters, to a lover of the arts, it presents a very unpleasant picture. The importance attached to wealth and the freedom which opens every legal avenue to wealth to everyone individually has two effects which are unfavorable to morals. It weakens the ties that bind individuals to each other by making all citizens rivals in the pursuit of riches, and it renders the means by which they are attained more indifferent. What a quote. Here's a guy saying that while, in order to be consistent with our founders, this is, of course, in the early 18th century, in order to be consistent with our founders, it was only the next step to make the suffrage available to more and more people, adult white males, of course. And while that was good, and it's something we can be proud of, and it's consistent with our efforts to create a functioning republic, the fact of the matter is it has its drawbacks. It scares the men of culture, the people of position, of leisure, of wealth, of education, of people who are familiar with the arts, because they begin to see that political decisions on who would be the best representatives are being made by people who really aren't qualified to make those decisions. And chances are the decisions as to who to vote for are going to be based principally on what's best for me. In other words, my self-interest. Who of the candidates will best give me what I want which is really not what the founders had in mind when they talked about staffing a republic. The idea was that the representatives of the people should be men of culture and position and leisure and familiarity with the arts. They should be cosmopolitans, those who can be models for those below them, those who can set an example of position and sophistication and culture and savoir-faire that others will mimic and want to copy. The result will be that those who hold office in our republic will be able to pull from the bottom those people who aspire to be intelligent voters as well with them. They will be models. They will be mentors of those below them. The danger is that the political system will cease to be that and instead will become much more vulgar, much more based on self-interest. In order to get votes, elected representatives will give the people who are inclined to vote for them what they want. In other words, political decisions are going to be made for the worst reasons rather than for the best reasons. And many people believe that it's going to corrupt our republic. Consequently, many of them, Benjamin Rush, Jefferson, and others, believe that the only way you could offset this is with a system of education which created patriots, little Republican machines, is what Benjamin Rush said. People who vote accordingly, people who have the proper priorities in order, who have their ducks in a row, so to speak, who know what the system requires and know what we have to have in office. And so education becomes not a way to educate people for personal success. Education becomes a way that you educate patriots so that the republic can be successful. And that's what you see in statements by Latrobe and many others. The point that I would make, we are at the bottom of our second hour. We have less than 30 minutes to go. So let's kind of bring this to a meaningful, logical conclusion if we can. What we end up with then is that the difference between conservatives and radicals oftentimes comes down to a difference in culture and position and leisure and the rest of it. And those who are most concerned about independence are concerned because they see all of these things being lost. Once you remove the British connection, once you take the lid off, so to speak, all hell is liable to break loose, and there's no way to control it. On the other hand, you have the Adamses and the Hancocks and the rest of them. John Adams, attorney, Harvard educated. Sam Adams, prominent political leader. John Hancock, wealthy, merchant, political leader, head of his own political machine. Samuel Chase of Baltimore, prominent attorney, later in the 1790s, going to be appointed as Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. As many of you know, he's going to be impeached under the presidency of Thomas Jefferson, but he's not going to be found guilty. And Christopher Gadsden and Richard Henry Lee, the Lees of Virginia, these are not radicals. Radicals don't grow up in places like this. Radicals don't come from these backgrounds. So these people are not after the kind of turmoil that many of these people believe that the rabble in the street would make happen if you take the lid off by declaring independence. These people believe that if you create solid Republican form of government with the right people in charge, and you build in virtue and you teach virtue in the schools and you set up education systems in the state in order to teach virtues and patriotism and Republican values and all the rest of it, you can basically go for independence and create for yourself an opportunity that no people in the history of the world has ever had. A situation where the people who are to be governed by this government are going to be the people who decide the kind of government they want to live under. I mean, that's something revolutionary in our society. So the question is, how radical is independence? How radical is the American Revolution? Is there really a revolution at all? Before we talk about it generally, let me share with you on that particular score the opinions of Gordon Wood, who's one of the world's authorities on this whole subject, author of The Radicalism of the American Revolution and a number of others. Got the wrong book in my hands here. Here we go. How radical is republicanism during this period in America? This is what Gordon Wood says. But republicanism was no less revolutionary for all of its conservative trappings. In fact, it was in every way a radical ideology, as radical for the 18th century as Marxism was to be for the 19th century. It challenged primary assumptions and practices of monarchy, its hierarchy, its inequality, its devotion to kinship, its patriarchy, its patronage, and its dependency. In other words, all the elements which made monarchical government work in the mother country and which allowed it to work throughout the colonial period in America, all of these become figments of the past, become elements of the past once you adopt Republican ideology. Republicanism offered new conceptions of the individual, the family, the state, and the individual's relationship to the family, the state, and other individuals. Indeed, republicanism offered nothing less than new ways of organizing society. It defied and dissolved the older monarchical connections and presented people with alternative kinds of attachments, new sorts of social relationships. It transformed monarchical culture and prepared the way for the revolutionary upheavals at the end of the 18th century. And then he goes on later on to talk about it. And I'm going to, if you don't mind, I'm going to pick up and just go a few. This is on page 109 of his Radicalism of the American Revolution. To continue, Gordon Wood says, suspicion and jealousy, essential as they might be in protecting liberty in a monarchy, were not noble or praiseworthy emotions in themselves. They were, in fact, necessary evils to offset the soaring passions of ambition and desires for power expressed by rulers or great men, and therefore to the degree that the rulers become virtuous and republicanized, the people could relax their jealousy and suspicion and become open and trustful. Barriers could be erected, bills of rights established, contracts negotiated, charters written, institutions arranged and balanced, and the people allowed a share of participation in government. But ultimately, the most enlightened of that enlightened age believed that the secret of good government and the protection of popular liberty lay in ensuring that good men of character and disinterestedness, wielded power. In the end, there was no substitute for classical republican virtue in the society's rulers, and everyone on the political spectrum paid at least lip service to the need for it. But no one paid more attention to this need for virtue than did members of the generation of North American colonial leaders who came of age in the middle decades of the 18th century. In other words, as these people adopted republicanism and the elements of republicanism, they did so with an idea that the key to the whole thing was virtue. You had to make sure that offices were staffed by good people. And if that was true, and if you made that your modus operandi, if that was your goal, then you could risk independence. And so in the First Congress, one of the most interesting things in the First Continental Congress, which meets in September of 1774 until until early in the winter of 1775, and then they adjourn and they agree to convene again in the Second Continental Congress in May of 1775. By the time they come back in May, war has broken out in Massachusetts. Concord and Lexington has happened. The Minutemen have driven the British outside Boston, and now there's a war going on. There's a Continental Army, and it needs a general, and that pretty much dictates what happens in the Second Continental Congress. But in the First Continental Congress, the emphasis is still in the jockeying between radicals and conservatives over the question of independence. And it's important to realize that the conservatives within the Continental Congress are miffed at mother country as well. In other words, they don't like what England's doing any more than the radicals do. The difference is they don't want to become independent over it because they fear that the cure will be worse than the disease. As bad as being colonies in the mother country right now is, we've got to find a way to fix this, because if we don't, we'll lose control over everything. We will lose the kind of society that we have grown up to worship and that has allowed us to achieve the positions that we have achieved. And so basically, in the Continental Congress, the debate is over what kind of action to take against the mother country in order to get the mother country to back off. One of the things that the convention first does in September of 1774 is to approve the so-called Suffolk Resolves. The Suffolk Resolves are a series of resolutions passed by those in Suffolk County, within which Boston is. Boston is located in Suffolk County. These are a group of positions adopted within Suffolk County, Massachusetts, in the fall of 1774, and they are sent to Philadelphia to the Continental Congress. And the goal is to get the Continental Congress to endorse these resolutions, the so-called Suffolk Resolves. And after much debate in the Congress does approve the Suffolk Resolves. And one of the positions that the Suffolk Resolves involves is the position of non-consumption of British goods. Up until this point, the colonies have very effectively used boycott. They refuse to buy from the mother country, but they don't refuse to buy from anybody. In other words, by boycotting the mother country, the colonists believe that's what caused England to back off and rescind the Stamp Act. And indeed, it's true. Pressure on Parliament from British merchants is what caused Parliament to rescind the Stamp Act in 1765, because the colonists were refusing to buy from the mother country, and it was hurting British merchant firms tremendously. And so they put pressure on the government to rescind the Stamp Act, which Parliament did in 1765. So the colonies had tremendous success in taking economic action against the mother country. But in the Suffolk Resolves, the action recommended was not just non-importation, nor was it non-exportation, the willingness to ship to the mother country. Rather, it was non-consumption. Literally, we will shut down our economy. We will not sell or we will not buy anything until the mother country backs off on the so-called, on the acts that Parliament has adopted against Massachusetts, the Massachusetts Government Act or the other, the so-called intolerable acts, as our textbooks call them. And the Continental Congress, by adopting the Suffolk Resolves, buys into the issue of non-consumption. Non-consumption is total economic boycott against the buying and selling of goods with the mother country. It is literally designed to force Britain to back down. And the conservatives within Congress know that non-consumption is pretty well a step on the way to independence, that a vote for independence is next. And it is at this point that a representative from Pennsylvania named Joseph Galloway introduces what is in some textbooks, but it's not covered that much. It's referred to as the Galloway Plan. And Joseph Galloway proposes his plan as kind of a last resort, with independence being the next step. And in his plan, he proposes a plan of union between the colonies and Parliament, which is not independence, which is not total concession to the mother country, but is not independence either. What he proposes is a colonial organization, a colonial organization made up of representatives from each colony, the chair of which will be a governor general appointed by the king. And this head of this plan of union, this leader appointed by the king, has a veto power over the actions of the legislative group. In other words, the colonies will make policy, will make decisions, but the king's representative, who chairs the group, has the ultimate veto. And what Galloway wants is a separation between those affairs that are imperial, in other words, which affect the mother country and the colonies. Those decisions ought to be made by England, he says. But the decisions that are purely local, that only affect what happens within the colonies, they ought to be made by this local group of elected representatives of each colony. So what he is proposing is an alternative to the Continental Congress. The difference is it will be chaired by a person appointed by the king. And the idea is that this plan of union will render to England those issues that are imperial and rightly belong to the mother country in her need to manage her colonies. But in matters that are totally internal, the Galloway Plan proposes that these decisions will be made within the colonies and will not require approval from London. It's a compromise. It obviously gets total support from the conservatives within the Continental Congress. And very honestly, it gets quite a bit of support from the radicals as well, because it's very, very difficult to oppose. How do you oppose Galloway's plan, which seems to be a reasonable compromise, and not admit that your ultimate objective is independence? In other words, it puts the radicals in a terrible, terrible bind, because it seems to be a very common sense, practical approach toward concessions which give the colonies some independence in matters which totally, involve only them, but it retains membership in the empire and gives to the mother country decision power over matters which are imperial in nature rather than local in nature. It becomes very, very awkward. Richard Henry Lee speaks in kind of out of two sides of his mouth. On the one hand, he seems to favor it, but on the other hand, he sees potential problems with it and says that it's not enough. Patrick Henry does the same thing. Patrick Henry supports it, but on the other hand, doesn't support it, if that makes sense. They're walking a very, very fine line, the radicals, because this proposal by Joseph Galloway seems to be a very rational approach to compromise. Anybody that would vote against this, Galloway believes, wants independence and nothing less, because this is workable. And he makes basic arguments in favor of all these things. He says that in imperial matters, we can't function as 13 independent colonies. There's got to be some sort of parliamentary supremacy in matters which Parliament ought to rule on. He basically in other words, wants recognition of the authority of Parliament where that recognition is necessary and called for. When the vote is taken, what they do is they appoint a committee. Don't we always appoint committees when we're reluctant to make a decision? They appoint a committee, and in the interim, while the committee is meeting, Galloway is persuaded to support the association, to support non-consumption, in the hopes that when the committee comes back with his proposal, that his proposal will trump the association. There'll no longer be the need for the economic boycott because we will have reached compromise with the mother country. And when the committee comes out and makes its recommendation on adoption, this is absolutely incredible to me. Galloway's plan is defeated in the Continental Congress by one vote. That's significant. It shows how close the Congress is divided. One vote defeats Galloway's plan. But this is the most incredible part. John Adams makes a motion that to include Galloway's plan in the minutes of the convention, in the minutes of the Congress, would prove very embarrassing to individual members, both those who voted for it and those who voted against it. So John Adams makes a motion that all mention that Galloway even presented a plan be stricken from the minutes of the Congress. And that motion passes by the same one vote. So not only does Galloway's plan lose by a vote, but the minutes of the Congress don't even reflect the fact that Galloway even made the proposal in the first place. Galloway recognizes that independence is the next step. There's no way to stop it. Galloway leaves and goes back to England and never sets foot in America again. And in 1792, he publishes from England a pamphlet called A Candid Examination of the Mutual Claims of Great Britain and the Colonies, with a plan of accommodation on constitutional principles. What Galloway does is he publishes a document in which he lets the world know what he had proposed and what happened to it. Other than that, we would never know it even existed because it is not in the minutes of the Continental Congress. Galloway's plan and the debates for and against it are some of the most interesting reading in this period. I was able, over the years, to purchase the letters of the members of the Continental Congress. There are 8 volumes of letters and journals of the members of the Continental Congress, edited and published by Burnett. Burnett's Letters of the Members of the Continental Congress is a classic. Last year, I was able to turn over all 8 volumes that I owned to Concord University's library. And so now these minutes are housed there. And to read what happens to Galloway's plan from, they are not in the journals, but to read Galloway's report about losing by one vote and then having all mention of the proposal stricken from the records, it kind of indicates how serious, it indicates several things. It indicates how serious the internal struggles between conservatives and radicals within Congress was. That's the first thing. It also indicates how evenly split the Congress was on the issue of independence. Again, that one vote is telling. It suggests reasons why those who were opposed to independence fought and fought and fought to prevent independence right up until the last minute. And then it's going to lay the groundwork for the kind of government, once independence is in the cards, once Richard Henry Lee makes his motion in June of 1776, that these colonies are and of right ought to be free and independent states, then Congress's response in passing it is to create two committees, actually three committees. One committee is to draft the declaration. That job is given to one of the members of the committee, Thomas Jefferson. The second committee is chaired by John Dickinson of Pennsylvania, a conservative. That committee's job is to draw up a plan of union, which becomes the Articles of Confederation. The third committee is a committee on foreign policy, and its job is to communicate with the major nations of Europe about what's going on and what independence means, and the desire of the newly independent colonies in America, in the United States of America, what becomes the United States of America, to trade with them and do business with them and honor their debts and obligations from that were incurred when they were colonies of Great Britain. In other words, the decision the Congress makes is it's very important that we have a form of union, that we have a Declaration of Independence explaining what we're doing and why, and that we make contact immediately with other nations in the world about what they can expect from us and what they need not worry about us. And those become the three committees of the Congress. And when Jefferson brings back his declaration, his draft of the Declaration, it undergoes debate, change. And Pauline Maier, in her book called American Scripture, makes the point that there are 85 substantive changes to Jefferson's draft of the Declaration before Congress is willing to approve the final document. And that vote is held on July 2nd, but the publication of the final document with revisions takes until July 4th, and that's why our celebration of Independence Day is July 4th rather than July 2nd. And with that, we have reached the end of our program, but we became independent today. That ain't bad for one day, first day of the week. I love this story. I just love this stuff. I appreciate those who have tuned in and those who will tune in on their iPods or whatever and get archives versions of today's program. We'll be back together again tomorrow. For the Virtual Center on the Study of the Constitution, I'm Bill O'Brien. I thank you for being with us. Please be safe. We'd like to have you back with us tomorrow.